It's an old question that we revisit, and that is, what is the association between a particular mechanism of governance, staggered board, and firm value? So staggered board, unlike a unitary board, requires that board members sit for election only periodically, usually every third year, meaning that a board member can be having a tenure on the board up to 3 years. Unlike a unitary board where every single year everyone gets elected. And that's pretty much the norm these days in corporate boards in the United States as we know it. So there are two competing views of how this relationship pans out. On the one side, the traditionalist view is that, or the Delaware view, also the director primacy view, is that there is no substitute for good quality directors, and as such, since shareholders lack the expertise and the knowledge or the incentives of the firm, the decision-making should be entirely left in the hands of the board members, and therefore a staggered board that protects such members from being exposed to the incentives of shareholders to sell their stock, and by doing so not commit into the implementation of longer-term projects in deciding what projects to take in the firm. The opposite view is the one about direct democracy or the managerial entrenchment, which states that firms will be harmed by having such a board because managers will capture the board if instead of being elected annually, directors get elected only periodically. That will, of course, be used to the advantage of management, not necessarily the advantage of firm, and the consequences will be a negative shock, a negative impact to the firm value. So two competing views. The current, I would probably not use the language paradigm, but the currently established and predominantly available evidence is in favor of having a negative association between the presence of a staggered board and firm value. Multiple studies of that, prominently Professor Babchuk has contributed many of those, but there are others, Fellaye among them, who have found both the impact on value and the impact on announcement returns when there is a staggering decision or de-staggering decision is consequently associated as predicted by the second, yes. Second one. So is it a quintessential corporate governance failure that we have in a staggered board, or is it actually an instrument that may help enhance firm value, for example, through the channel of committing shareholders among other stakeholders to long-term value creation? So that will be the trade-off we will try to establish in this particular paper. Again, the literature has gone in the direction of saying that this is a failure and that it's almost always the case that it's an unmitigated evil in terms of corporate value to have a staggered board. We revisit that evidence. We use more data to do so. We use data which is starting in 1978, 30 plus years of such data, and we find the opposite. We're able to replicate the findings of prior work in the time series and establish that indeed in the time series among firms that have staggered boards, the value should be lower in any particular point in time. However, what we find is that when one revisits this relationship in the time series with data which is spanning some 30 plus years, exactly the opposite will be true. That is the first step of this investigation. And we will test for its robustness first. Second, we will attempt to reconcile these findings with our striking findings in the time series. So making sure that we understand why time series and cross-sectional results are consistent. And lastly, we will go with a battery of tests which are geared to present a positive account of staggered boards and to disprove the managerial entrenchment view of staggered boards in those. So I can present to you very briefly what directions of analysis we will take in the positive account. our main hypothesis will be that staggered boards serve as a committing device, pre-committing the board members to long-term value creation, essentially implementing long-term projects. However, there are competing theories that can also account for this finding in the time series beyond the reverse causality, which helps us, makes us consistent with the time series and to the cross-sectional findings. And those go along the lines of staggered boards, the probability of being taken over in firm value. That's one plausible such explanation. Or any substitution between governance mechanisms. For example, staggered boards may come up with mechanisms which are mitigating the effect of staggered boards, and in fact, they're offsetting it to the point where they generate positive value. So we will try to see whether any of those alternative explanations that we can come up with help us reconcile and to build some support for the positive account of staggered boards, and then we will conclude what we find. That is essentially our work. So the data that we use is slightly different than the prior data work in this line of the literature. So what we have done here is we used the data that was collected by one of the co-authors, Martijn Kramers and Alan Farrell, for staggered boards and in general governance provision, including G-index count provision, that is other anti-takeover provisions, starting 78. Now, this is different than the traditional source, which starts in 1990, and most of the studies who have used that have come up naturally to slightly different, well, substantially, strikingly different conclusions than ours. We also did a verification of the data, which is 1990 till date, because as it turns out, there are certain errors in classification of staggering and de-staggering in the data as we know it. You know, especially they could lead or lag the actual dates, and we had to hand check all of that. We also use the standard data sources for firm value, announcement returns, etc. So without further delay, let me show you the data. So this is the overall data variation across years from 78 to 2011. So there are three distinct episodes here. The first one is the episode of staggering up till the 1990s. And then we have this plateau, which is the period on which most of the current research is focused, with very little variation in staggering or de-staggering. And then comes the period following 2005 of plentiful of de-staggering decisions that we have seen. Yes? I apologize here, you're probably not visible, but it goes up to about 60%, 65. Currently, we're talking about 45% having a staggered board. I apologize for, I should have moved the graph. So if you take into isolation only the period prior work has focused exclusively on, it's clear to see that the limitation in variation, which has driven also the choice of techniques to analyze it, is quite strong. There is very limited impact here. There are only few staggering and de-staggering decisions in the period of study of prior work. And that in itself is an important contribution here, because we're able to utilize two other episodes, either with a lot of staggering or a lot of de-staggering, which will help us get more out of this data. Now, there is indeed quite a lot of variation, and let me explain what this cohort graph does. Again, the scale there is 100%, and it goes to 0, 100 to 0. So there are six chart lines here. I'll focus only on the 78 cohort, although it comes in pairs. 78 cohort with or without staggered board, 1990s, and 2000, roughly every decade comes with a single cohort, because we have 30-some years of data. So, for example, the no staggered board in 78, which is the square graph, shows us what happens among those firms which had no staggered board in the 78 cohort as they survive through time till the end of the sample. Obviously, survival limits the number of those that we will have at the end, and we count among surviving firms in any particular year what is the percentage that had staggered versus, a percentage of those that remained unstaggered or no staggered board from the initial cohort up until the end. And as you can tell, there is a substantial change over time. So the percentage of no staggered is about 60 all the way up to the 1995 among those which in 78 did not have a staggered board. And after that, we have like a stable period at about 50% of all of those having, that survive of course, having no staggered board. And then there is a rapid de-staggering in place that you can see. So at the end of the day, out of those 684 in 78's cohort we started with that had no board, that is staggered, only 146 fit the category of no staggered board by the end of the day. And by the end of the day, we have, that represents about 30% of the entire sample that survived. The same is the case for the staggered board in 1978. So that will be the triangles. They're probably, I apologize, staggered board in 1978. This is the X. As you can tell, there is quite a lot of change going over time with rapid de-staggering, which happens past 2005. On average, the sample will have about 54% of the firms taken together without, with a staggered board. So again, what we'll do next is we'll replicate existing work, essentially the cross-sectional work on staggered board and Q regressions. Then we will revisit it with firm fixed effects. And then we will try to reconcile the two by arguing that the cross-sectional results are subject to reverse causality. And then we will move on to fill the gap on exactly what drives the positive account of staggered boards, because reverse causality helps reconcile, but it doesn't explain its existence. Some data collection issues. In addition to the new data that starts 78 and ends 1990, there are issues with the existing data that is also in the prior studies. Miscoding, but they are not as frequent. We attribute that to only a few cases. We fix those. And here are the first set of results. So the first column here, 78 to 2011, presents the effect of staggered boards on Q. And consider Q being on average about 1.6. That's about 3% negative impact, 2.7 to be precise, if there is a staggered board. The effect is there with or without clustering. I should emphasize that prior work usually doesn't cluster. But if we cluster still, we find that it is there. It's slightly less what, for example, Babchuk and Cohen will come up with an estimate, but it is still there. It is negative. The exact replication of Babchuk and Cohen, for example, produces also a negative coefficient. However, it is not significant when you cluster. We suppose they did not cluster because their result is significant. Absent clustering, it is significant as well. So we're able, more or less, to come up to their estimates in terms of economic significance and statistical significance. Now, here is what happens if we also split, as prior studies have split, the effect of staggered boards in terms of it being either in the charter or in the bylaw. Now, why would this matter? Going back to the initial setup where I said that there are two views of staggered boards. One which states that directors being very important, informed, knowledgeable directors, very important in the decision-making process, versus the view that it's easier to capture a board if directors are elected for multiple years. So the managerial entrenchment, the latter, versus the former, which is the director primacy. It is easy to see that if a charter is the venue through which a board is being staggered, it will be harder for the shareholders to push through with their propositions. Therefore, the negative view of the staggered boards will be established primarily through the channel of cases of a staggered board in the charter. I should say, though, that it's possible to have a board staggered in both charter and bylaw. Very few limited cases, in which case we will entirely attribute it to the charter, because the charter will give more power to the board members, not the directors, especially in companies that are incorporated in Delaware. Replicating the findings on Babchuk and Cohen once again shows that there is the sign that they've anticipated mostly in the cross-section, but when we do exact replication of their results, we're unable to find what they found. In fact, we find a positive coefficient on Stagger charter. We would anticipate there will be a negative coefficient, but it's positive. We don't take much out of this because coefficients are insignificant. They're zeros anyway. So we just basically say we're unable to replicate those. Now, once we put the firm fixed effects, the striking finding is apparent. Not only the negative sign disappears, we actually get a positive sign, which is statistically significant at conventional levels. Beyond statistical significance, there is also economic significance. For example, this coefficient of 0.059, that translates in about 4% increase in firm value, and that comes from column number 1. Naturally, not all specifications find what we anticipate. For example, little variation in the 1990s to 2000, column number 3, produces an insignificant estimate. Is this necessarily a negative account of what we anticipate? No, it's just meaning that the data is too stable, too persistent on staggered boards for us to be able to tease out any identifiable effects. I also want to highlight that in column number 2, the period where we had plentiful of staggering up, the effect is positive but insignificant. So it is hard to argue that the results of this paper are entirely driven by one particular period, the period in which we have novel data not used in prior studies. It doesn't appear to be the case. Even if you firm cluster, the results in the overall sample are significant at the conventional statistical significance level. Very importantly, when you redo the analysis of charter versus bylaw for the time series, the effect is once again reversed, and more prominently so for the Stagger board charter, as opposed to Staggered board bylaw, which seems to suggest that the interpretation in the prior literature of staggered board serving the purpose to amplify managerial entrenchment is not true, because if it was true, that would not be positive significant coefficient. What I want to add here that is not shown in the current version of the paper is that we also used another experiment geared to tease out the effect of managerial entrenchment on firm value or Q staggered board relationship. This is the Moran v. Household decision of 1985, which made which gave power to the board to unilaterally implement a poison pill by a simple phone call after that decision of the Supreme Court in Delaware. So if the managerial entrenchment view on staggered board is borne by the data, we will anticipate that the negative impact of those boards that are staggered on firm value will be a lot stronger after Moran v. Household. We don't find that. In fact, we find no difference pre and post in both the cross-sectional and time series analysis, once again lending some support to the fact that maybe the prior cross-sectional evidence is not complete. So that was the first take we have on the data. The second take on the data is we run first differences regressions with or without the lag on the dependent variable. Strikingly, once again, we find a positive relationship. Now, I should say that the magnitude to year number 5 here seems tremendous. And these are with clustered standard errors at the firm level. We also did New West with 6 lags to make sure that the overlap is not causing this. It's not that. The reason you see such high magnitudes in great part is because in this regression, we didn't include year fixed effects or industry fixed effects. So once we do that, once we adjust for the industry, for the annual averages on the dependent variable, and we include industry fixed effects in addition to clustering at the year level, a prescription that we took from Matza and Gormley, the results get a bit weaker. In fact, the economic magnitude across the 5th-year horizon is 7%. So it's half of what you see there, but in line with what the 1-year impact in the Q regressions is. in the single panel firm fixed effects panel regressions is. The economic significance is slightly weakened, but it is still significant across all horizon observations at conventional levels. Lastly, we also do portfolio analysis. The portfolio analysis here follows the format of Babchuk, Cohen, and Farrell. So what we will do is we will build monthly portfolios. We add to the portfolio in 3 different scenarios, and then we keep passively for a number of months. So the 6M12 portfolio is constructed to add every month, in which we learn of a company having announced that the board is. So we split it, Stagger and de-stagger. So let's pick up the Stagger portfolio. So for the Stagger portfolio, we will add into the portfolio the moment we learn that they have such portfolio, such staggering in place, and we'll keep it for 12 months. That's what 6M12 stands for. The 6 comes from the fact that we put the particular stock in the Stagger portfolio 6 months prior to the fiscal year end at which they announce it. Because typically the way it works is as follows. When there is a staggering decision, it's usually packaged with other decisions. For example, a particular board member has to be elected, but he or she will never be elected unless there is a staggering for multiple years. So it's always a packaged decision. Thank you. And that packaged decision would then be postponed as far as possible, especially in Delaware incorporated firms. So the lag with which this is announced is reversed by 6 months. We also reverse by 12 months in the other 2 portfolios, and we have 2 horizons of keeping, 12 and 24 months in the second case as well. So we do that for the long portfolio, which is the portfolio of staggering up, and then we also short the portfolio, which is de-staggering, and we take the difference. Obviously, very thinly traded. In fact, they're not traded portfolios. These are just very thinly populated portfolios, so on average 13 firms members per month in each of those. Nonetheless, we get positive alpha. It varies, of course. About 5% here for the equally weighted, just for the 4-factor model for the 6M12 portfolio. It's a little higher for the 12M12, and slightly different if you do the value weighting as well. So it is there for this particular choices of portfolios in this particular construction. I just want to stress that it is different what we do from what Babchuk, Cohen, and Farrell do. What they do is they split the level, right? They will look into those that have and do not have. We don't do that. We only take changes. Now, I should also say, if we do exactly what they do, that is analysis which mimics the cross-sectional work they've done, we get negative alphas. So if we just split between between having and not having the staggered board, and then we build those portfolios as we go through time, as they did, this will become negative alpha. Here we focus on changes, basically the adoption or abandonment of a staggered board. So across all these 3 sets of results, we are able to establish that once you control for the firm fixed effects, take first differences or build the changes portfolios, you end up having a positive account of staggered boards. So how do we reconcile it? One potential way to reconcile it is to basically argue that certain firms are willing to adopt a staggered board in response to firm value being low as an anti-takeover device. And that will help us reconcile what we find that staggered boards lead to an increase in firm value with those of the cross-sectional studies that found this negative association. This, however, would not be able to explain the first differences, so we will still have room to fill for a positive account of staggered boards. So very briefly, we split the staggering and de-staggering decisions in predictive analysis, and we do find that indeed having low firm value as proxied by Q does lead to a greater likelihood of staggering up. There is no impact on the staggering, but there is a strong impact, especially in a hazard model, nearly 57% increase in the likelihood of staggering up. And no such effect if you look into the de-staggering decision. So that lends some confidence that what we find and what the cross-section finds are in fact consistent. But that's not enough. So the next, and to make sure that we're not wrong here, because if it's really just lagged Q that would matter, we replicate the work of the cross-sectional analysis with the lag of Q. Once you do that, all of their results go away. So what is this meaning? This means that, I have no time. All right, so the positive account is what remains, and I just quickly, in a minute, if I may, summarize what we've done. Again, we will seek ways to establish that a long-term commitment story explanation for why staggered boards add firm value is the one that drives our results. How do we do that? We will study firms for which long-term commitment is more important and their relationship between Q and staggered board. What kind of firms we anticipate will fall in that category? Firms with more intangible assets, more complex firms, firms with more innovation, firms with more R&D. We find support across all of those four. However, this is not the only story. One could argue that an alternative is that since staggered boards are placed in anticipation of takeover pressure, and takeover pressure leads to higher prices, this could in itself explain what we find. We test for this, I apologize, it's not in the current version of the paper, by including interactions of staggered board and M&A activity at industry and annual levels, insignificant in all specifications. And lastly, if I may, there was also the concern that we have an incomplete picture here because it could be the case that having a staggered board means you don't have something else. For example, a staggered board may mean weaker incentives to the CEO. It may mean also, stronger incentive to the CEO. It may also mean less other anti-takeover provisions, for example, poison pill. Or it may also mean that the CEO is not the board chairman anymore, etc. So the substitution may itself explain it. We don't find that.